Plato's Republic is one of the foundational texts of the entire Western philosophical tradition. As the title suggests, it's about public affairs, it's about republics, about political philosophy, as much as anything else. But of course it also deals with ethics, with metaphysics, with epistemology, with many of the foundational issues of philosophy all across the board. I want in this and the next few videos to talk about the Republic's views of political philosophy specifically, on the question who should rule and what should be the ideal form of government for a republic. Because Plato has a lot to say about this, a lot that is, I think, deeply insightful, no matter what you happen to think of the rest of Platonism. In fact, there are many things in the Republic that almost anyone in the modern world would find objectionable. But I think there are important insights that he expresses concerning the nature of political leadership, really, and the structure of a political authority. And so we're going to talk here about that question of leadership. Who should rule in the ideal state? And then later we'll talk about the four basic forms of government, how they develop, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and then how one turns into another. So let's start with this question of who should rule. The basic problem of political philosophy, in a sense, is that in forming a government, we have some people ruling over other people. There is a kind of authority we grant to those in positions of leadership. Well, who should they be? We don't want to be ruled by just anyone, and indeed history is full of examples of people who are political leaders who exercise political authority and political power to greatly damaging ends. The question of who should rule is a fundamental question of political philosophy. We have to think about all sorts of things, about ideal forms of government, about principles of government, but we also need to think about, in practice, who is going to rule. And here I don't mean should I vote for this candidate or vote for that candidate, but I mean in general, what kinds of qualities are we looking for in a leader? The right leader can lead a nation to happiness and to greatness. A terrible leader can lead it to disaster. So let's think carefully about this question along with Plato. Plato refers to those who should rule as the guardians. So who should be a guardian? He says, well, really we want to give authority to the very best of these guardians. And the best guardians, he says, the most regardful of the state, are those who are intelligent. So first of all, we need people who are going to be the best people for leadership. They are going to be the most mindful of the state, the most careful with it, and they've got to be intelligent. We've got to have leaders with the intelligence to understand complex problems, to think through complex solutions, to be able to recognize not only the likely effects of their actions, but also the effects of those effects, and then the effects of those effects of effects. And so in short, people have to be able to think about higher order causal relationships. They have to be able to think about incentives that they're creating, not only the immediate effects of their actions, but the long-term effects as people's behavior changes in response to what they do. All of that requires a high degree of intelligence. But it requires a number of other features as well. Plato says they've got to be capable. These are people who need to not only understand a situation, to be able to devise solutions, to be able to recognize the complex and higher order consequences of actions, but they've also got to be able to actually implement what they do. It won't help if we have a leader who thinks great ideas but can't put them into practice. So we need people who are intelligent, we need people who are capable. But he says there's another very important condition. We need people who love the state, who are dedicated to the state and its welfare. It is vital that people who lead a country love that country. We need people, he says, who are going to be the most careful of the interests of the state, the most dedicated to it. And he says one would be most likely to be careful of that which he loved. We need people who love their own society, their own state, who are going to promote its interests. Now, I think it's important to recognize this because it's something that when I look around the modern world, I don't see in a lot of cases. In fact, it seems to me that a main condition of the 20th century extending now into the 21st, is that a large number of countries are ruled by people who hate them, who do not like the country as it is at all, and who are seeking to turn it into something else. That dedication to some ideal other than love of country, sometimes I think motivated by hatred of country or an attempt to distance oneself from one's own background and one's own country, but also a desire to, let's say, promote the interests of the world at large as opposed to the interests of the state that you're actually a part of. Plato sees these as deep dangers. He is not a cosmopolitan. He is somebody who advocates, well, what the Stoics would call oikophilia, somebody who is dedicated to the love of his own. And so we need leaders who are intelligent, who are capable, but also who are truly dedicated to the welfare of their country, who love that country. Because if they don't have that love of country, they're not going to be dedicated to serving it. Instead, they're going to be serving something else, typically themselves. Plato is well aware of the principal-agent problem. That is to say that in selecting people to be political leaders, we are putting them in charge of our own interests. We are in effect hiring them, much as any principal engages an agent to do that. Maybe a sports star engages an agent to negotiate a contract for him. Or maybe you hire a real estate agent to help you buy a house or sell a house. Perhaps you look to a lawyer for legal advice on something. You, in short, go to somebody with greater expertise than yourself and greater ability in a certain area and ask them to represent your interests. Well, that's exactly what we're doing in any political society. We're selecting certain people to look out for our interests. And in an ideal circumstance, they do look out for our interests. Now, Plato recognizes there's a problem here because they also have private interests, and it may be that they are in effect in a conflict of interest. Their own interests might not coincide with the interests of the people they rule, in short, with the interests of the state. So we need leaders who are going to have their own interests coincide with the interests of the state. In short, we need interests who are not going to be prey to a conflict of interest, who are not going to present us with a serious principal-agent problem. How do we pick them? Well, we need people who really identify with the state, who love the state, who see their own interests as intimately tied up with the interests of the state. And so if we've got a separation there, if someone who is in a position of leadership in the state thinks of him or herself as having private interests or being dedicated to some kind of ideal or theory that is different from the interests of the state that person leads, we're in trouble. We have a serious principal-agent problem. So Plato says we need people who see their own interests as intimately connected with those of the state, whose interests are ideally absolutely identical with the interests of the state. He says we must look for those who are the best guardians of the indwelling conviction that what they have to do is what they, at any time, believe to be best for the state. Now, where do we get such people? Socrates is painfully aware that it's a difficult problem. After all, people do have interests of their own. They have interests in their own private affairs. They also have interests in promoting a certain vision of the state, which may or may not be in its own interests. And so Socrates says it may be difficult to find people like this. How do we go about doing it? He says, well, we have to lie. We have to tell one noble lie. What is that noble lie? We have to tell these people. First of all, we have to identify them. That's hard enough. But then we have to tell them that they are uniquely suited to rule. Now, he says that this is really not quite true. But on the other hand, if we simply say to them, listen, you seem to care about the state, why don't you subordinate any other interests you have to the interests of the state? We're going to find that the most intelligent, most capable people are not willing to do it. Indeed, Socrates says, why would anybody be willing to exercise leadership in a state where this is what we expect of them. We expect them to identify completely with the welfare of the state. He says, well, there's only one reason, really, and that is that such people would fear being ruled by somebody inferior to them. So we've got to appeal to them on that basis. We've got to say, look, you are uniquely qualified to rule. If anybody else rules, they're not going to do as good a job, and you're going to be subject to the disadvantages of being in a state where you are ruled by somebody who is not nearly as good as you. Now, he thinks that's a serious incentive. If, of course, somebody says, well, I'm not uniquely suited to rule, yeah, I could do a good job, but there are plenty of other people who could do a good job, they're not going to be willing either. That's why we have to tell them the lie, that they're really uniquely suited to rule. It can't be just anybody or one of a large group. We've got to say, no, it's you. We need you specifically, because anyone else is going to do a worse job, and you're going to end up being unhappy. You're going to be frustrated thinking, I could do a lot better job than that. Indeed, we've got to say, that is true. So you have to be the one to step up and do it. Now that idea that we tell people you are naturally suited to rule, it's something that just is part of your nature. This is what you're meant for. And you're really not just one of a vast number of people who could do this. It's a small number of people who could possibly do this, who are naturally suited to rule. Well, he says it's not true, but we have to say that in order to get people to do it. So let's suppose we do get somebody to do it. They step up, they assume that position of leadership. Leadership presents people with a lot of temptations. After all, with leadership comes political power, and power tends to corrupt. So how do we keep people focused? Even if they start out as people who really identify their own private interests with the interests of the state, how do we get them to keep identifying that way? After all, there are going to be a lot of temptations, so even if they don't start out having a principal agent problem, well, it may develop. Conflicts of interest may occur. So we have to maintain their focus on the welfare of the state. How do we do it? Socrates says that any time we put people in a position of political leadership, in a position of power, there is a danger that they will convert from good leaders to savage masters. And so how do we set up a situation where that cannot happen, where they are going to remain focused on the state? Here it's not just a question of lying to them, and it's not just a question of selecting the right people who will not be subject to temptation. Such people may not exist or may not be available. Instead, he says we have to set up a system that does not allow them to promote their own private interests. And so Socrates says, those in positions of leadership, they must own only indispensable property. They must have no more than adequate compensation. If they own anything more, it disqualifies them from leadership. Now this is quite a harsh statement, but he's effectively saying this. Really, we should have these guardians, the people in positions of leadership, live in something like military barracks style. They should have nothing more than basic needs met. They should live in, well, a house no better than the average house. They should have no more than average possessions. They should have no more than average compensation in terms of income or anything of that kind. In short, we have to strictly limit them. We say, in effect, your salary is tied to the salary of the average person in this society. Your wealth has to be no more than the average wealth of a person in this society. Where you live can be no better than average, and so on and so forth. We've got to guarantee that. Now, there's an obvious worry here. How do we actually manage to accomplish that, number one? And secondly, will anybody be able to rule under those circumstances? Will they be willing to rule? For one thing, you might think ruling requires more than that. After all, It would be odd to have the White House just be an average house that somebody gets invited to. And so you might worry that actually we need, for political purposes, more than this. But you also might think, look, good people aren't going to be willing to do that. We're talking about highly intelligent, highly capable people, people who could be successful in many different areas. Why are they going to be willing to be just average? Maybe a modern equivalent would be to say, if you are entering political service, you have to take anything you happen to own and put it in a blind trust. And so you cannot know what you're invested in, what kinds of goods are really at stake in decisions you make. In short, you may not have any information about how any of this would affect your own welfare. That might be hard to do in practice. And it might be that some people who have succeeded strongly in one area of life know perfectly well what company they started and they own, may know perfectly well what kinds of assets they have in the background. And so it may be that that really isn't feasible either. I think it's a hard problem. The only way to solve this problem, Socrates says, is to bring up people with this expectation from childhood, to create a kind of leadership class. And so we extend the noble lie. It's not just that you individually are naturally suited to rule. It is that you people are naturally suited to rule, and you are simply raised from childhood with the expectation that you will rule. Now, this is the kind of thing that happens in a monarchy where the prince or the princess grows up thinking about their role as being one to rule. Of course, princes, princesses, kings, queens generally live lavishly. Here we would have a class like that. But on the other hand, it wouldn't all fall on an individual necessarily. They would be part of a small group. But in addition, the conditions under which they would grow up would be much more like the average military person. So they would not be in a position of lavish palaces and the very best food and the very best clothing, etc., etc. No, if anything, theirs will be rather Spartan in orientation because they will have to focus their own interests completely on the interests of the state. Now, can we find such people? If we find highly successful people, highly talented people who are intelligent and capable and so on, are they going to be willing to be part of this group even when told a noble lie, even when raised that way? Well, maybe, maybe not. But suppose we can solve that problem, and Socrates seems confident at the end of Book 3 that we can. Even so, it's a temporary solution. Later he looks at the 4 basic forms of government, and it turns out that even if you have the right people in positions of leadership, things deteriorate. After a while, they are succeeded by leaders who are not nearly as talented and who have other kinds of concerns. And so we have, in the short term, a solution to this problem of who should rule, who would rule and truly promote the interests of the state. But inevitably, no matter what the form of government is, people end up taking over that role who cannot fulfill it well. And so each form of government ends up deteriorating and turning into a different form. I think then overall in the Republic, the message is rather pessimistic. The political problem has at best a short-term solution. In the long run, there really is no solution. It may be that the problem of who should rule and what the structure of government ought to be is ultimately insoluble.